They gave me a desk in the subsistence wing because nobody else wanted it. That was the institutional logic at Vethon Interstellar Academy. If a space had no functional claimant, it defaulted to whatever contract worker the logistics office had most recently failed to assign a proper billet. I was nutritional logistics technician 3rd grade, attached to the academy on a 6-month service contract to audit dietary supply chains and report on cross-species caloric compliance. It was not a glamorous posting. The office that processed my intake paperwork had listed my species on the wrong line of a standard form, filed me under support fauna, and then spent 2 weeks trying to locate which enclosure I was supposed to be housed in before someone in biological sciences looked up what a human actually was and redirected me to the civilian contractor wing. I did not make a fuss about any of this. I was good at not making a fuss. My desk was a low slab of cast composite in a back corner of the subsistence wing's administrative anteroom, positioned between a broken humidity regulator and a supply locker that smelled powerfully of something I chose not to identify. The wing itself was a long, low facility, 3 institutional kitchens in a row, each equipped for different atmospheric pressure tolerances, feeding into a communal hall that seated 200 with room for the ambient sound to die before it reached the back wall. It was not a warm space. The overhead panels threw a flat white light that made everything look like evidence. The ventilation hummed at a frequency that lodged behind the molars after the first hour. I liked it well enough. I have worked in worse places than honest, ugly rooms with good bones. The subsistence wing's primary academic function was a module called Resource Utilization, a required course for second-year cadets across all disciplines, roughly translated. The premise was simple in the institutional sense. Cadets were expected to demonstrate that, in the absence of standard galactic supply chains, they could sustain themselves and their units using whatever materials the environment provided. It was a survival module dressed up in nutritional language, and the academic credential attached to passing it was modest, but the institutional culture around it was not. Vethon had been running the module for about 300 years by the time I arrived. In that time, it had developed a reputation for being the course that showed cadets something about themselves they would not have chosen to see on their own. The module's lead instructor was a Drassic named Pelanvoer. Drassic are a species I had not encountered personally before Vethon, though I had read the available biological literature during my transit and had some sense of what to expect. They are bilaterally symmetrical, roughly humanoid in silhouette if you do not look directly at the upper thorax, and they possess an olfactory system of such precision and range that it constitutes a social organ in its own right. Where human cultures have built complex webs of meaning around visual signaling, expression, gesture, posture, Drassic culture has built an equivalent web around scent. Status is communicated through controlled aromatic compounds their bodies produce in specialized glands. Emotion is readable in the same way. Intellectual respect is a smell. Contempt is a smell. Hospitality, at its fullest cultural expression, is a smell so specific and layered that Drassic architecture for several centuries was designed primarily to capture and retain it. The relevance of this to cooking will be apparent. Pelanvoer was a senior instructor with the kind of posture that comes from decades of practice. He was tall for a Drassic. They average about 1.5 meters at the shoulder when fully upright, but he had a way of extending his upper frame that added another 15 centimeters and made him seem to fill the doorway he stood in. His 3-fingered hands were usually folded behind his lower back when he was not actively gesturing. His coloration was the deep charcoal gray that Drassic developed past their 100th year, with the faint blue-silver tracery along the jaw that indicated gland maturity. He smelled, as best as my limited olfactory system could register, of something between clean stone and very old authority. He did not acknowledge my presence in the anteroom on the first day, or the second, or the third. This was not rudeness in the Drassic register. it was categorization. I had been placed in a support fauna enclosure, then recategorized as civilian contractor, and then filed under audit staff. Each recategorization carried its own social weight, none of which placed me in the tier that required acknowledgement from a senior instructor. I understood this and did not take it personally. I ate my lunch at my composite slab and read supply manifests, and listened to the second-year cadets file in and out of the kitchens for their practical sessions. The cadets were a standard Vethon intake cohort, maybe 60 in the second-year resource utilization section, drawn from about a dozen species. The majority were Jurassic, because Vethon was a Jurassic-founded institution and drew heavily from that population. There were a substantial number of Thurin, thick-limbed, four-armed, excellent spatial reasoning, tended to cook by feel rather than measurement and were usually right. A smattering of Levoth, who are crystalline in their dietary metabolism and were taking the module on a special adaptation track. Several Goran, who I knew from the literature, had a complex cultural relationship with prepared food as a concept, and 3 humans. The 3 humans were not what I would call a sample of my species at its most composed. Cadet Ruiz was 19, and had come straight from a deep space secondary school where, by his own account, the cafeteria had served 2 dishes, protein brick and the other protein brick. Cadet Osai was a year older, sharp in most of his coursework, and had been raised in an off-world family where cooking was simply not a skill that had been passed down, a gap he seemed simultaneously embarrassed by and cheerful about. Cadet Yen was a human Thurin dual heritage cadet, who identified culturally as human on her intake forms, but ate with Thurin utensils, and had once told Ruiz that she didn't trust anything she couldn't eat with a grip fork. I am telling you about them because they are important to what happened, and because I want to be fair to them. They were not bad cadets. They were not even particularly bad cooks in ordinary circumstances. They were simply second-year cadets at an alien academy in their second year of being away from Earth, and the resource utilization module was about to remind them of something that second-year curricula are traditionally designed to remind cadets of, that there is more ground below your feet than you have yet stood on. The module's final practical, what Pelanvoer referred to in his initial briefing as the Terminal Provision Assessment, was announced on a Vethon Standard Tuesday that the calendar told me was the 44th day of my posting. I was at my composite slab when Pelanvoer addressed the assembled cohort in the communal hall. I could see them through the anteroom's observation window, an interior glass panel set flush with the wall, its purpose unclear to me but useful as a passive monitor. The cadets were seated in the tiered rows that ran the length of the hall. Pelanvoer stood at the front on a slightly raised platform, his upper frame extended to its full height, his hands clasped behind his back. He told them, in the formal Jurassic-accented galactic standard that all Vethon instruction was conducted in, that the terminal provision assessment would take place in 8 days. The challenge was as follows. Each cadet would be assigned to one of 6 working teams of 10. Each team would have access to 1 standard interstellar ration allocation, the same field issue allocation provided to military units operating in low supply chain environments throughout the galaxy. Nothing supplemental. No academy stores, no personal provisions, no equipment beyond what the kitchens carried. Their task was to produce a complete, nutritionally adequate multi-course group meal for their team of 10 from this allocation alone, in a preparation window of 3 standard hours, to be consumed communally in the hall. He paused after saying this. The pause was practiced. He then said that in the 17 cycles he had run this module, no team had produced a meal that met the full rubric criteria. Several had come close. Most had produced edible food. The purpose of the assessment, he said, was not primarily the meal. It was the process of discovering what you did not know, in a controlled environment where the cost of not knowing was academic rather than terminal. The cadets wrote this down. I wrote it down too, in the margin of the supply manifest I was reading, because it was the kind of thing worth writing down. He was, in his way, a good educator. I also wrote in very small letters beside it, 8 days. I want to be precise about what a standard interstellar ration allocation actually is, because the story requires it. A standard issue field ration allocation, as distributed across the majority of galactic military and survey operations, is a marvel of compression engineering. It is designed by people who have thought very hard about caloric density, shelf stability across wide temperature ranges, and palatability across the largest possible range of species metabolisms. The result is a set of dense, compact, shelf-stable blocks of consolidated biological matter, fats, proteins, complex carbohydrates, mineral complexes, pressed into forms that survive hard vacuum, extreme cold, radiation exposure, and the kind of handling that happens when supply drops go wrong. They taste in their unmodified form like nothing that deserves a specific description. Not bad, not good, consolidated, like someone had surveyed the concept of food and produced an abstraction of it. The allocation issued to each team for the terminal provision assessment was sized for 10 individuals at maintenance-level caloric input for 72 hours. It came in a standard issue gray case. The case contained 48 ration blocks in 3 configurations, dense fat, complex carb, and the mixed matrix blocks that tried to do both, 4 compressed flavor concentrate strips in 4 different profiles, a saline hydration compound in powder form, and a small packet of binding agent used primarily to help cadets who were injured in the field consolidate damaged ration blocks into a paste that could be swallowed. That was it, that was the pantry. I know this allocation well. I had grown up around it in the way that children who grow up in families that have spent generations in deep space logistics tend to grow up around things. My mother had cooked from this allocation, her father before her, his grandmother before him. Going back 6 generations, my family had been in the supply chain business. Not the glamorous end, not the navigation or the command or the engineering, but the end that thought about food specifically, and how to move it and store it, and in a pinch make it into something a person would actually want to eat. 6 generations is a long time to learn one narrow subject. Long enough that the learning stops feeling like learning and starts feeling like weather, just the condition of the air around you. I did not grow up thinking I knew something about ration blocks. I grew up not knowing that what I knew was unusual. The distinction matters, because it is the distinction between someone who has studied a thing and someone who has simply lived inside it long enough that the thing has become ordinary. I am not saying this to impress anyone. I am saying it because it is the relevant qualification, and because it explains why, when Pellanvoer announced the terminal provision assessment on that Vethon Standard Tuesday, I sat at my composite slab and felt a specific mild feeling that I can only describe as, this one I know. The 8 days between the announcement and the assessment were instructive in the way that observing preparation is always instructive. I watched the cadet team study. I watched them pull up the technical literature on ration block composition, the manufacturing specs, the known interaction tables, the official academy notes on basic preparation techniques. I watched them practice, a little, using the academy's standard training blocks, which were inert simulants without the full nutritional matrix, but with the correct texture and density. I watched them argue about methodology and defer to Pellanvoer's preparation guide, a 40-page document distributed to all cadets, which covered standard hydration and heat approaches to the blocks and yielded, if followed correctly, something that would technically qualify as a hot meal. Pellanvoer's preparation guide was a good document for what it was. It was also, from my perspective, working within a very narrow bandwidth of what the material could do. I watched a Thurin cadet at Station 5 spend the better part of an afternoon trying to separate a dense fat block into layers with his 4 hands, gripping it from each cardinal direction and applying slow, steady pressure, which was the Thurin instinct for any material that needed to be broken down. The block did not separate into layers. It compressed further. He stared at it for a long time, set it down, and went back to the preparation guide. I noted in the margin of my manifest that the Thurin approach to the material was structurally wrong, and that no amount of the preparation guide would correct for it, because the preparation guide assumed linear hydration-first processing, and the Thurin instinct was to work the material physically before applying liquid, which produced the opposite of the correct result. I noted this and went back to my manifests. I watched a Jurassic cadet at Station 3 produce, with considerable technical precision, the preparation guide's recommended output, a correctly hydrated, correctly heated reconstitution that smelled, to my limited nose, like warm food. To a Jurassic nose it would have smelled like process. Like the abstract category of food, performed correctly according to documented method. She had done exactly what the guide said. The guide had not told her what the guide could not tell her, which was how to make the material smell like something more than itself. I watched this for 8 days. I watched cadets practice and research and confer and cross-reference. They were working hard. They were doing what they had been trained to do, which was apply the available documentation to the available problem. The available documentation was insufficient for the problem's highest criterion, and none of them knew it yet, because the highest criterion was embedded in a cultural register that the documentation had not been written to address. The day before the assessment, Cadet Osai stopped at my desk. He had been past my desk many times without stopping. He had the manner of someone who was aware of the desk's existence, and who had not yet decided what category to put it in. Civilian contractor desks are not a feature of most academy environments, and the social protocol around them was not well established at Vethon. But on this particular afternoon he stopped, and leaned on the doorframe of the anteroom, and looked at me with the expression of a young person who has decided to ask an unglamorous question, because all the glamorous avenues have not produced a useful answer. "You work in nutrition logistics," he said. "That's on the intake form, yes. Do you know anything about the field ration allocation?" He held up the course materials slightly, as if to be precise about which allocation he meant. "The one they issued us." I looked at him. I looked at the materials. "Somewhat," I said. He told me then about the assessment, not in any way that assumed I didn't know, but in the careful way of someone trying to establish context. He said their team was worried. 3 of his teammates had never cooked from scratch at all. They had the processing knowledge but not the physical instinct for it. 2 more had been practicing with the simulants and producing technically correct output that tasted like warm composite. He had read the preparation guide 3 times, and each time had come away with a growing conviction that the guide was teaching him to produce the worst version of what the blocks could be. "Is he right that no team has ever passed the full rubric?" I asked. "That's what the seniors say. A few have come close." "What's the rubric criterion they usually miss?" He looked at the materials again and found the page. "Aroma integration," he read. "Defined as, the preparation must demonstrate culturally appropriate aromatic complexity consistent with a fully prepared communal meal, rather than the base compound scent profile of unmodified field rations." I sat back in my chair. Aroma integration. Pelanvoer had, with considerable pedagogical craft, constructed a rubric that required cadets to pass a criterion that only an olfactory-dominant species could fully assess on its own sensory terms. The Jurassic sense of smell was not something a Thurin or a human could measure or compete on, except by producing an output that a Jurassic would register as adequate. The preparation guide's standard hydration and heat approach did not produce that output. The approach yielded food, nutritionally sound, texturally edible food, but it did not generate the layered volatile compound release that a Jurassic nose would read as a real meal rather than processed substrate. The gap between those two things was, in drastic cultural terms, roughly the gap between a rain puddle and an ocean. And there was no way to address that gap from the preparation guide alone, because the preparation guide had been written for a generalist audience and did not contain the specific techniques, the layering of heat application, the controlled hydration ratios, the timing of the flavor concentrate releases, that would push the ration block's chemistry toward the aromatic range a Jurassic nose would recognize and file as hospitality rather than emergency sustenance. Those techniques existed. They were not obscure. They were simply not in the 40-page guide because the 40-page guide was written to teach survival, not ceremony, and the people who knew the difference had mostly learned it outside of any document. My grandmother called it waking the block up, her words. Not a technical term, but accurate. I looked at Osei for a moment. "What station is your team assigned to?" I said. "Station 4, he said, "the one with the steam lines on the right. And the other two humans, Ruiz and Yen." He blinked. "They're in my team. I asked to be grouped." I nodded slowly. That was either very smart or very fortunate, probably both. "I have some notes from my family's protocols," I said. "I can write them up tonight. They're not Academy standard documentation, so they won't qualify as official preparation guidance under the module rules, but they're notes from practice, and the practice is legal. You would be adapting them to the rubric yourself. I'd be giving you a direction, not a recipe." He looked at me the way people look at something they were not expecting and are not entirely sure how to categorize. "That would be, yes," he said. "That would be good." I typed up 6 pages that night at my composite slab. 6 pages sounds modest, but they covered substantial ground, because the techniques involved are not complicated to describe, but they are precise about the things that matter. I wrote about the angle of heat application before hydration, 45 degrees to the heat source, not flat, not vertical, and about counting the seconds before the drop, which varies by steam temperature and requires you to calibrate by ear rather than instrument. I wrote about the sequence of the flavor concentrate strips, which is not simultaneous, and which the preparation guide does not address because the guide treats the strips as a single additive step rather than a 2-part process with a gap between. I wrote about the hydration ratios for the different block types, which differ from the guide's recommendations by small amounts that produce large differences in the aromatic output. I wrote at the top of page 1 the sentence my grandmother had written at the top of the equivalent document she had given my mother, which my mother had given me. "The materials are not obstacles, they are the question. Your job is to find the right way to ask." I rolled the 6 pages into a cylinder, held them with a logistics office rubber band, and slid them under the door of the cadets' prep study at roughly the 22nd hour of the Vethon day. I did not knock. I went back to my billet, ate a protein brick from my own supply, and read the rest of the manifest I had been working through. Assessment day arrived in the flat institutional way that assessment days always do, ordinary morning light. The same ventilation hum, the same smell of cleaning compound on the hall floors, and 60 cadets moving with the specific gravity of people who have been counting down to a thing and have now arrived at it. I was at my composite slab by the time the cohort assembled. Pelanvoer stood at the front of the communal hall again and ran through the rules again, formally and without abbreviation. 3 hours, the issued allocation only, the 6 stations, the rubric criteria. He mentioned aroma integration. He mentioned it with the even tone of an educator who knows that the thing he is mentioning is the one most cadets have not solved, and who has, over 17 cycles, become practiced at keeping that knowledge entirely out of his voice. He gave the start signal. 60 cadets moved to their stations. I moved to Station 4. I want to be transparent about this. I had not intended to participate actively. My role was observer and auditor. My contract did not include instructional functions, even informally. and I had been careful with the 6 pages I had written to frame them as notes rather than guidance. But when I came around the corner of the anteroom and saw Cadet Osai at Station 4, looking at the gray allocation case, with the expression of a person translating a document in real time, and when I looked at the kitchen layout and saw that the station's unused secondary workspace, a long surface along the left wall that nobody had claimed, was exactly the right distance from the steam lines to use the radiant heat the way I knew it could be used. Something in me settled into a very simple decision. I put my audit tablet on the shelf above the secondary workspace. I took off my outer jacket, folded it on the shelf beside the tablet, and rolled up my sleeves. Then I looked at Osai and said, "Give me one of the dense fat blocks and both flavor concentrate strips, the mineral profile one and the resinous compound one. I'll be on the secondary station." He looked at me, he looked at the workspace, he looked back at me. "Are you allowed to?" "I'm not cooking for the rubric," I said. "I'm cooking for the people who are going to eat this. That's a different thing." He considered that for about 2 seconds, which was the right amount of time, and then he slid me a dense fat block in both strips. And then we worked. Here is the thing about ration blocks that the preparation guide does not cover, because the preparation guide is trying to teach a repeatable survival technique, and what I am about to describe is not a technique so much as a conversation. The blocks are compressed. Compression is not just a physical state, it is a chemical state. The organic compounds inside the block are not merely packed together, they are in a kind of stasis, held stable by the press and the cold process bonding that makes them shelf-stable for years. You can heat them according to the guide's instructions, standard hydration first, then sustained low heat, and you will get food. The compounds will release. The block will reconstitute. You will have a hot, edible, nutritionally sound product. But if you introduce the heat before the full hydration, and if you introduce it from the right angle and at the right speed, the block's outer matrix fractures along the compressed grain boundaries before the interior has released, and the volatile compounds in the fat layer, the ones that carry most of the block's aromatic potential, get a brief, intense thermal event that forces them open rather than letting them seep out slowly over a long heat application. That brief intense event is the difference between food that smells like warm composite and food that smells like something was cooked. It smells like the intention behind the meal rather than the ingredients. My grandmother demonstrated this to me when I was 8 years old on a supply tender running a long outer system route in a utility kitchen not much larger than a maintenance closet. She held a dense fat block over a field burner at about 45 degrees to the heat source, not flat, not vertical, angled, and she counted to 7 under her breath, and then she dropped it into the hydration pan. The smell that came off the pan was not a complex smell by any measure, but it was a warm smell, a real smell, the smell of something that had been touched by heat with intention. She looked at me and said, "You see, it's awake now." I did see. I was 8, I did not forget. At Station 4, I held a dense fat block over the edge of the steam line at the angle I had learned in that utility kitchen between stars, and I counted to 8 instead of 7, because the steam temperature was slightly higher than a field burner, and I did not want to push the outer matrix past fracture into degradation. Then I dropped it into the hydration bath. The smell that came off the bath was immediate, not loud, not the kind of thing you smell from across the room yet, but present, real, the kind of smell that the body recognizes before the brain gets there. Yen, who was 2 meters away working on the carbohydrate component with her grip forks, went still for a fraction of a second. Then she kept working, but her posture had changed. She was leaning slightly toward the station, without being aware of it. That is what waking the block up does. It does not change the nutrition. It does not add ingredients. It changes the room's relationship to the food. I am not going to give you a moment-by-moment account of the 3 hours, because 3 hours of cooking, even good cooking, does not compress well into linear description. What I can tell you is the shape of it. In the first 40 minutes, Station 4 was the only station with a secondary cook. I was not directing Osai and Ruiz and Yen. I was working beside them on my own materials, and occasionally saying things like, "Move the hydration bath left about 10 centimeters," or "The second strip goes in after the bath, not before," in the quiet way of someone noting what they observe rather than instructing. This distinction matters to me even in retrospect. I was not their teacher. I was the person with the secondary workspace who had been doing this for longer. The other 5 stations were working through their preparations with the focused competence of cadets who had prepared thoroughly and had a documented methodology to follow. Station 2, the drastic majority team, moved with precision. Everything measured, everything timed, the preparation guide referenced at each step. Their output at the 40-minute mark smelled, from the distance of Station 4, like a technically correct execution of the guide's recommended approach. Not bad, not warm, correct. Station 3 was struggling quietly. The team's lead preparer, a Goran, whose cultural relationship with food I had noted earlier, was working with the evident discomfort of someone performing a ritual they find philosophically troubling. The Goran do not traditionally prepare food communally. It is, in their social structure, a private act, and the academy module forced them into a public performance of it. They produced food. It was the product of a person doing something correctly in every technical sense, while being somewhere else in their head. Station 5, the Thurin-heavy team, had the opposite problem. They were fully present, confident, and wrong in a specific structural way. I watched the Thurin cadet I had observed all week attempt the physical separation approach again with the dense fat block, pressing from 4 directions with his 4 hands. The block did not separate. He looked at it. He looked at his teammates. He said something in Thurin-accented galactic standard that I did not catch. Then he set the block in the hydration bath hole, which was at least the right direction, but without the pre-fracture thermal event, and the bath produced the standard reconstitution, uniform, nutritionally sound, and aromatic in the way that an abstraction of food is aromatic. At the 40-minute mark, Cadet Yen looked at the secondary workspace and then at her station and made a decision. She did not ask. She moved her workpiece to the secondary surface, tilted the dense fat block to the angle she had seen me use, and counted under her breath. I did not say anything. I watched the steam. She was off by 2 counts, went a 10 instead of 8, but the steam temperature had dropped slightly in the last several minutes because one of the other stations had drawn pressure, and 10 was probably correct for current conditions. She dropped it and looked at me. I gave her a small nod. She turned back to her work with the expression of someone who has just added something to their permanent inventory. At the 60-minute mark, the adjacent stations had begun to notice the smell coming from Station 4. Not dramatically, not with gasps or sudden gestures, but in the small way that bodies notice things before minds do. Postures shifted. 2 Thurin cadets at Station 5 turned their heads in unison without any apparent discussion. One of the Drassic cadets at Station 3 stopped what he was doing for 2 full seconds, and his olfactory ridges, the secondary nostrils that flare along the upper jawline in their species, were visibly active. Then he went back to work, but I noticed he was moving slightly faster. Pelanvoer was moving between stations, observing. He had not stopped at Station 4 yet. His circuit brought him past the end of the communal hall and back, methodical, the 40-page guide held loosely in one hand, occasionally pausing to make notes on a rubric tablet. When he passed the end of the kitchen row and came within about 8 meters of Station 4, I saw his George's flex. He did not stop walking. He made a full turn back toward Station 1, and I watched the set of his upper frame change in a way that was small and precise. He knew, of course he knew. His olfactory system was a precision instrument. He had known for the last 20 minutes that something on the left side of the kitchen row was outside the expected scent profile, and now he was close enough to identify the source. He did not come to Station 4 on that pass. He went to Station 2 instead and made several notes. At the 90-minute mark, I had the base of what I was building and could begin the integration work. This is the part that the flavor concentrate strips come in, and the part that requires the most patience, because the integration is not additive. You cannot simply apply the concentrate to the prepared material and expect the aromatic compounds to bond. You have to introduce them into the thermal environment while the material is still in the final stage of hydration, at the point where the surface chemistry is open. The resinous compound strip goes in 17 seconds before the mineral profile strip, not simultaneously. They need to establish in sequence because they have different bonding temperatures, and if you introduce the mineral profile strip too early, the resinous compounds crowd it out, and you get an aromatic profile that is single note, which in drastic cultural terms reads as efficient rather than ceremonial. Efficient is fine. Ceremonial is what passes the rubric. I had not put this in the 6 pages I wrote for OSI because I had not been certain I would be here to do it. I was glad now that I was. Cadet Ruiz had moved to work alongside me at the secondary station at the 80-minute mark, without announcement, simply arriving beside me with the complex car blocks and beginning to work them through the pre-fracture process at the angle he had watched me use for the better part of an hour. He had not asked. He had watched until he understood the angle, and then he had started doing it. He miscounted his first block, went to 6, which was 1 short, and the outer matrix didn't fully fracture. I watched him look at the bath and recognize from the smell that something was different. He pulled the block out with a towel, re-angled it, counted to 9 to make up for the lost thermal exposure, and dropped it back in. The smell from his bath was slightly rawer than mine, but in the right range. He had self-corrected by reading the output rather than recounting from the beginning, which is the right instinct and is not obvious to everyone. I said nothing. I introduced the resinous strip. The smell that came out of the bath at that moment was not subtle. It was not a classroom smell. It was a kitchen at the end of a long day smell, a family at a table smell, a you have come a long way and now you eat smell. It was warm in the specific way that warmth means safety. It was rich without being heavy. It had the layered quality that comes from 2 different volatile compound profiles establishing in sequence. The resinous base laying down, and then the mineral profile arriving on top of it, the 2 of them producing a combined aromatic output that was greater than either alone. 3 stations stopped simultaneously. Not in chaos, not in any dramatic way. The cadets at stations 2 and 3 and 5 simply paused and looked, and then resumed working, but they resumed with the slightly unfocused quality of people whose attention is divided. Somewhere in the back of the hall, I heard one of the Jurassic cadets make a sound that I did not recognize, a low, brief sound from deep in the chest, more reflex than communication. Cadet Ruiz beside me said very quietly, "Oh." Not a question, not an exclamation, just, "Oh," the syllable that the body makes when it recognizes something it did not know it had been waiting for. I did not look at him. I was watching the bath. "Mineral strip," I said. He passed it to me without being asked a second time. At the 2-hour mark, Pelanvoer came to Station 4. He stood at the boundary of the workspace and observed. He was using the rubric tablet, but he was not writing on it. His olfactory ridges were in full flexion, a drastic physiological response to scent information that is dense enough to require active processing rather than passive reception. It means, in their biology, something like, I am paying complete attention to this. I was portioning the prepared material into service dishes. The Academy's serving equipment was standard, flat composite dishes designed for multi-species use, no particular aesthetic value, functional. I was not doing anything ceremonial with the plating. The food did not need ceremony in its presentation because the smell was already doing the ceremonial work. The dish was the vessel. The smell was the meal. Pelanvoer watched me portion 4 dishes in sequence. Then he said in Galactic Standard, "What are you doing?" I set down the portioning tool. I looked at him. "I'm serving the meal," I said. "You are not a cadet enrolled in this module." "No," I said. "I'm the nutritional logistics technician from the supply audit office. I'm cooking because there was an unused workspace and I was hungry." He looked at the dishes. He looked at me. There was a long pause that I allowed to be long because the pause was his to fill or not fill. "What did you put in the hydration bath?" he said. "Flavor concentrate strips in sequence, standard issue from the allocation case." I gestured to the empty wrappers I had laid neatly on the side of the workspace. Nothing supplemental, everything from the case. He picked up one of the empty wrappers and looked at it. The wrapper was standard issue. He had seen hundreds of them. The wrapper did not explain what had happened in the bath, because what had happened in the bath was not in the wrapper, it was in the technique, and the technique was not documented anywhere at Vethon. He set the wrapper down. "The aroma integration criterion," he said and stopped. "The rubric criterion," I said, "specifies that the preparation must demonstrate culturally appropriate aromatic complexity consistent with a fully prepared communal meal. It does not specify the preparer's enrollment status." Another pause. "I'll need to review the rubric language," he said. "I'm certain you will," I said. He looked at the dishes one more time. He looked at Osai and Ruiz and Yen, who had been standing in a careful stillness that I recognized as the stillness of people who are very interested in the outcome of a conversation, but have been too sensible to insert themselves into it. Then he looked at his rubric tablet. He made no marks on it. He turned and walked back toward the front of the hall, and I watched the way his upper frame held its extension, and I noted that the set of it had changed again, not in a dramatic way, nothing readable to a non-Jurassic observer, but his upper shoulders had shifted by about 2 centimeters. The posture did not read as defeat to me. It read as a person who has been handed a fact that doesn't fit any existing category and is moving away to find a category that fits it. I picked up the portioning tool and finished serving the meal. The 3-hour window ended with a signal tone that rang through the hall, and the 6 teams assembled their output on the service tables at the front for rubric assessment. Pelanvoer moved down the tables with his tablet, making notes on each team's presentation. He did not rush. He was methodical, the way a good educator is methodical, taking the process seriously even when the outcome was already somewhat clear, because the process is what the students are learning. Station 4's output was on the end of the table. I was not standing at the table. I had returned to the anteroom and was at my desk, eating one of the protein bricks from my own supply. I watched through the observation window. Pelanvoer reached Station 4's output last. He stood in front of it for a longer time than he had stood in front of any of the others. His olfactory ridges were in full flexion again. He was not writing on the tablet. He stood the way a person stands in front of something that has asked them a question they did not prepare for. The communal hall had been filling with the smell from Station 4 for the better part of 2 hours by this point. It had spread the way heat spreads, gradually, pervasively, until the room's temperature had changed without any single moment you could point to as the turning point. The other team's outputs were present in the air too, and they were fine. They smelled like food, which they were. Station 4 smelled like something else. It smelled like the reason people gather around tables in the first place. The Jurassic cadets in the hall had been reacting to it for the last 40 minutes, with the low chest reflex sound I had first heard at the 90-minute mark. It was happening more often now. A few of them had stopped pretending it wasn't happening. 2 of the Jurassic cadets near the front of the hall were standing closer to each other than they had been at the start of the assessment, the way that beings of any species tend to close physical distance when something in the environment is signaling that the moment is shared. Pelanvoer stood at the table, and after a very long moment he wrote something on the rubric tablet. I could not read what it was from the anteroom window. He moved on, completed the rest of his circuit, and returned to the front platform. He announced scores by team number without elaboration. Station 4's score was the highest in the 17 cycles he had run the module. He said this once, in the same even voice he used for everything, and made no additional comment about it. Then he said the meal would be served in 5 minutes. Cadets should take their seats. I did not eat in the hall. I was not part of the cohort, and the meal was theirs in the institutional sense, and in the deeper sense that it was the thing they had made, and the meaning of eating it together was the meaning that Pelanvoer had built the module to produce, even when the module didn't produce it. Tonight it had. The least I could do was let them have it without an audit observer at the table. I ate my protein brick at my composite slab and listened through the anteroom wall. You cannot see a smell, but you can hear what it does to a room. You can hear 60 cadets settling into a communal meal with a quality of quiet that is different from ordinary quiet, not the quiet of an exam hall or a briefing room, but the quiet of people who are attending to something. There were voices, because there are always voices, but they were unhurried voices. They had the cadence of conversation that happens when nobody needs to be anywhere yet, when the time available is not the point. There were sounds of eating. There were occasional drastic chest reflex sounds that were no longer occasional. At one point, somewhere around the 20-minute mark of the meal, I judged by the Vethon wall clock I could see from my desk, the entire hall went briefly quieter than it had been. Not silent. Just quieter, the way a room goes quiet when something has landed in the collective awareness simultaneously, and everyone takes a moment to be in the same place at the same time before the voices come back. Then the voices came back. At some point during the meal, someone in the hall started talking about home. I do not know who started it. I could not hear the words clearly through the wall, but I recognized the quality of the conversation, the way you recognize any conversation about home, even when you cannot make out the specific content. There is a particular warmth in that kind of talking, a particular unhurried willingness to be somewhere else for a moment while remaining where you are. It is the conversation that happens around a table when the food is right. It is the conversation you do not have when the food is merely correct. It is, in some ways, the point of the whole exercise, not Pelanvoer's exercise specifically, though I think he knew what he was aiming for in his way. I mean the older exercise, the one that started the first time something cooked over something burning, and a group of beings stood around it and were briefly somewhere other than cold and alone. I finished my protein brick. I filed the rest of my manifest paperwork. At the end of the hall's ventilation cycle, I heard the cadets begin to disperse. The sound of 60 people in various stages of a full and satisfied meal becoming 60 people who have somewhere to be next, which is a different sound from the sound of people escaping a room. They moved slowly. They talked. The Jurassic cadets were making a quieter version of the chest sound that I had come to understand from the literature was the equivalent of involuntary satisfaction. The sound a Jurassic makes when an olfactory experience has been sufficient in the deep cultural register to count as hospitality received. It is, in their biology, not entirely voluntary. They do not decide to make it. It happens when the thing that has been happening is the right thing. I listened to them go. Then the hall was empty and the ventilation ran, and I put on my outer jacket, and I picked up my audit tablet, and I walked out through the anteroom into the corridor. Pelanvoer was in the corridor. He was standing at the far end, near the door to his instructional office, with his rubric tablet under one arm and his hands folded behind his lower back. He had the air of someone who had not happened to be standing there, who had in fact been standing there for a few minutes, waiting without making it apparent he was waiting. I stopped. He looked at me for a long moment. In the corridor light, his blue-silver jaw tracery was clear, and his olfactory ridges were in a resting position, which in Jurassic physiology indicated either contentment or deliberation. I had learned, in 44 days of desk time in the subsistence wing anteroom, to read the difference. This was deliberation. Nutritional logistics technician, he said. Instructor Pelanvoer, I said. The rubric, he said, does not specify preparer enrollment status. No, I said, it doesn't. I will be reviewing the module documentation before the next cycle. That seems reasonable. He was quiet for a moment. His jaw ridges shifted, not to full flexion, but to the intermediate position I had come to associate with him processing something he found unexpected. The technique you used, he said. The angle of heat application before hydration. That is not in any preparation guide currently in the Academy's curriculum library. No, I said, it wouldn't be. It's not really a technique in the documented sense. It's more of a habit. A habit? Something my family did, I said. Practical knowledge from a long time working in logistics. I paused. 6 generations. He stood with this for a moment. He did not look anywhere but at me, which was, in Jurassic social register, a fairly significant act of attention. The aromatic profile your preparation produced, he said, and then stopped. I waited. It is, he said, the profile associated with what my species classifies as hospitality at cost, the category of meal that is prepared when the available resources are insufficient, and the preparer draws on something other than ingredients to close the gap. He was choosing his words with care. It is considered in our cultural registry to be the highest category of communal food preparation, not the most elaborate, the most significant. I looked at him. The ration block material does not typically produce that profile, he said. In 17 cycles of this module it has not produced it. I had not thought it could. It can, I said. The compounds are all there. They just need to be asked the right way. He looked at me for another long moment. There was something in the way he was standing that I did not have the cultural vocabulary to name precisely. The posture of a Jurassic who has spent 17 cycles certain of the limits of a specific problem, and has tonight been shown that the limits were in the map, not the territory. Then he said, "Where did your family learn to ask the right way?" "I don't know exactly," I said. "Somewhere between supply runs that went long and the choice between eating what you had and not eating. You figure things out." He was quiet. I said, "Good night, instructor." "Good night," he said. I walked to the corridor junction and turned left toward the contractor billets. Behind me, I heard the door to his instructional office open, and after a moment, close. The next morning, the smell was still in the walls. This is not a metaphor. The subsistence wing's ventilation systems were old, and the ductwork ran through the shared building walls in a way that was not ideally efficient, and the volatile compounds from a sufficiently aromatic preparation, one with enough thermal activation to push the compounds deep into the material, could linger in the structural fabric for a day or more. I had worked in buildings like this before, on supply stations where the kitchen had been operating for 50 years, and the smell of accumulated cooking had become part of the building's identity, part of what the building was. I went to my composite slab that morning and sat down, and pulled up the day's manifest and could smell, faintly but clearly, the previous evening's meal still present in the air around me. It was a warm smell in a cold institutional room. It was the smell of something that had been made rather than produced, a distinction that matters more than it sounds when the thing that was made from almost nothing. I sat with it for a while before I opened the manifest. Cadet Osai came by mid-morning with a data chip. He set it on my desk without saying anything, and I turned it over and looked at him. "Notes," he said. "From what we did last night, I wrote down what I observed, the angles, the counts, the sequence of the strips, best as I can replicate it." He paused. I thought for Ruiz, and yen, something to keep. I turned the chip over in my hand. That's good practice, I said, writing down what worked. I wrote down something else too, he said, about the 6 pages you slid under the door. What about them? I asked some of the other cadets on Station 4, not Ruiz and Yen, the others, whether they thought the human contractor cheated, essentially, on the rubric. He said this without embarrassment, which I respected. It was a fair question. The Jurassic cadet on our team, Cadet Haven, said he didn't think it was cheating. He said the rubric criterion was the rubric criterion. And then he said something I wrote down because I wasn't sure I understood it fully. What did he say? He said, the meal produced a hospitality signal at the highest Jurassic cultural register. He said his grandmother used to tell him that category of meal only gets produced when someone has been feeding themselves from insufficient materials for long enough that they have stopped noticing the insufficiency. He said he didn't know humans had that. Osai looked at me. I wrote that down. I sat with it. Tell Cadet Haven he's right, I said. Osai nodded. He picked up nothing else. He had come with the chip and a message, and now he had delivered both. He turned to leave. Osai, I said. He stopped. The counts, I said. When you write them down for Ruiz, they vary by steam pressure. Write down the method for checking the pressure, not just the numbers. The numbers are the answer to a specific question. The method for checking is how you ask the right question every time. He looked at me. He took a small notebook from his breast pocket and wrote something in it, one short line, and put it back. Yes, technician, he said. And he went to class. I finished the posting at Vethon 6 months later, as contracted. The supply audit report I filed was 17 pages, covered 4 supply chains, and recommended 3 adjustments to the Academy's cross-species caloric compliance framework that were accepted and implemented. It was a good audit report, the kind of report that does exactly what it says it will do and nothing more or less. On my last day in the subsistence wing, I went to my composite slab one final time and sat down and looked at the broken humidity regulator and the supply locker that still smelled of its mystery and the observation window that looked into the communal hall. The hall was quiet, no session that morning, a maintenance cycle. The long tables were clean. The overhead panels threw their flat white light onto nothing in particular. I sat there for a few minutes, not for any reason except that I had been sitting in that specific spot for 6 months and habits accumulate. You spend long enough in a room and it stops being the room and starts being the place where you did the work. The distinction is not nothing. The smell was gone from the walls by then. Enough time had passed and the ventilation had run enough cycles and the compounds had dispersed into the wider air of the building, and from there into the wider air of everything else. That is what smells do. They don't last. They exist in the moment of the meal and in the memory of the people who were at the table, and neither of those things needs the walls to hold on to it. Somewhere in the Vethon Academy curriculum library, I knew, an instructor was working on a new preparation guide. I did not know how many pages it would be. I did not know whether it would contain the sentence my grandmother had written at the top of hers. Probably not in those words. But the knowledge it would have to carry, the specific, practical knowledge of how to ask the right thing from insufficient materials, that knowledge had been in the room. It was in 3 cadets who had graduated the module with the highest recorded score, and who would carry what they knew to wherever they went next. It was in a Jurassic cadet named Haven who had written something down that night in his own notebook. It would move the way that kind of knowledge always moves, from hand to hand, from kitchen to kitchen, from one long run to the next. I folded my outer jacket over my arm. I picked up my audit tablet. I walked out of the subsistence wing and into the corridor, and the corridor smelled like clean floor compound and recycled air, and I went to collect my transfer papers from the logistics office, and I thought about my grandmother, and about the utility kitchen between stars, and about the field burner held at 45 degrees, and about the count of 7. "Just rationing blocks," she said. Then the entire barracks smelled like home.